The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Ridge, Arizona, as 23-year-old Magnolia Maggie Thornfield stepped down from the stagecoach. Her delicate frame seemed almost lost beneath the heavy traveling dress, and her pale complexion spoke of a life spent indoors, far from the harsh frontier sun. The other passengers barely glanced her way as they collected their belongings. Just another fragile Eastern lady seeking adventure in the Wild West, they assumed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maggie adjusted her wire-rimmed spectacles and surveyed the ramshackle buildings that lined the street. Copper Ridge wasn't much to look at: a saloon with peeling paint, a general store with a crooked sign, and a blacksmith shop where the rhythmic pounding of hammer on anvil echoed through the desert air. Tumbleweeds skittered past her feet as a hot wind whipped through the settlement, carrying the scent of sage and something else, something that reminded her of the steel mills back in Pittsburgh. She had come west not for adventure, but for necessity. The telegram in her reticule bore devastating news. Her uncle Jeremiah had died suddenly, leaving her his copper mine and the small cabin that sat at the base of Thunder Mesa. Maggie had never met Uncle Jeremiah, but he was her only living relative, and his unexpected inheritance represented her sole chance at independence. The factory job she'd left behind in Pennsylvania paid barely enough to keep her fed, and the boarding house where she'd lived was no place for a woman alone. As Maggie made her way toward the livery stable to arrange transportation to the mine, she couldn't help but notice the stairs. A group of rough-looking men lounged outside the saloon, their weathered faces split by knowing grins. She caught fragments of their conversation as she passed. "Look at that little sparrow," one of them chuckled. "Bet she faints at the first sight of blood. Probably came out here thinking it's all like dime novels," another added. "Give her a week before she's begging for passage back east." Maggie kept her eyes straight ahead, but she memorized their faces. She'd learned long ago that underestimation could be a powerful weapon when wielded correctly. These men saw exactly what she wanted them to see: a helpless, naive girl who had no business on the frontier. The livery stable reeked of hay and horse sweat. An elderly man with graying whiskers looked up from mucking a stall as she entered. "Help you, miss?" "I need transportation to the Thornfield mine," Maggie said, her voice soft but clear. "I'm Jeremiah's niece." The man's expression shifted, becoming wary. "That so? Well, I'm afraid I can't spare a man to take you out there today. Too dangerous with all the trouble that's been brewing." "What kind of trouble?" He glanced around nervously, before lowering his voice. "Cattle baron named Rex Hawthorne's been buying up all the land around Thunder Mesa. Word is he wants your uncle's mine something fierce. Been making offers, generous ones, but Jeremiah wouldn't sell. Now that the old man's gone." He shrugged. "Well, let's just say Hawthorne ain't the type to take no for an answer." Maggie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. Surely he wouldn't try to intimidate a woman. The stable-keeper's laugh was bitter. "Miss, you don't know Rex Hawthorne. He's got a crew of the meanest cowboys this side of the Colorado River. His foreman, Dutch Morrison, once broke a man's arm just for looking at him wrong. And Hawthorne himself," he shook his head. "That man would steal pennies from a dead man's eyes if he thought it'd turn a profit." Despite the warning, Maggie pressed on. "I still need to get to the mine. Surely someone in town. I'll take her." Both Maggie and the stable-keeper turned toward the voice. A tall man stepped out of the shadows at the back of the stable, leading a magnificent black stallion. He was lean and rangy, with sun-bleached hair that fell to his shoulders and eyes, the color of winter sky. A battered hat sat low on his brow, and twin Colt revolvers hung from his hips with the easy familiarity of a man who knew how to use them. "Cole Mackenzie," he said by way of introduction, touching the brim of his hat. "I knew your uncle." The stable keeper's face went white. Now hold on there, Cole. Miss Thornfield don't need to get mixed up in whatever's between you and my business is my own, Gus, Cole said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. He turned to Maggie. Your uncle was a good man, honest. That's more than I can say for most folks in these parts. Maggie studied him carefully. Cole Mackenzie carried himself with the predatory grace of a man accustomed to violence. But there was something in his manner, a restraint, perhaps, or a weariness that suggested depths beneath the surface. What's your interest in helping me, Mr. Mackenzie? A shadow passed across his features. Let's just say I owe Jeremiah a debt I can't repay to him anymore. Cole, Gus warned, Hawthorne's got it in for you something fierce. Taking her out there will be my decision to make, Maggie interrupted, surprising both men with the firmness in her voice. She looked directly at Cole. When can we leave? Now, if you're ready. 20 minutes later, Maggie found herself mounted on a gentle mare, following Cole's black stallion out of Copper Ridge. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a vast expanse of red rock and scrub brush that shimmered in the heat. Mountains rose like jagged teeth against the horizon, their peaks lost in haze dot as they rode. Cole remained mostly silent, but Maggie found herself stealing glances at him. There was something compelling about his stillness, the way he seemed to listen, to sounds she couldn't hear and see things that escaped her notice. Twice he held up a hand, bringing them to a halt while he studied their back trail, his pale eyes scanning the rocks for signs of pursuit. You're worried about something, Maggie observed during one of these stops. Cole's gaze shifted to her, appraising. Hawthorne's got ears all over this territory. Word travels fast when someone new comes to claim the Thornfield mine. You think he'll try to stop me? I think Rex Hawthorne doesn't leave anything to chance. Cole urged his horse forward again. Your uncle died sudden, but not unexpected. He'd been getting threats for months. The casual way he said it made Maggie's blood run cold. Threats? What kind of threats? The kind that usually end with a shallow grave and a mysterious disappearance. Cole's voice was matter-of-fact, but Maggie caught the tension in his shoulders. Jeremiah wasn't the first small landowner to die under suspicious circumstances. Won't be the last either, unless someone puts a stop to it. They crested a ridge, and Thunder Mesa came into view, towering formation of red sandstone that rose from the desert floor like a sleeping giant. At its base, Maggie could see a small cluster of buildings, the mine office, a cabin, and what looked like the entrance to the mine itself, carved into the living rock. There she is, Cole said, the Thornfield mine. Your uncle pulled a fair amount of copper out of that mountain over the years. As they descended toward the mine, Maggie noticed fresh wheel tracks in the dirt. Someone's been here recently. Cole's hand moved instinctively toward his gun. Stay close. They approached the cabin cautiously. The front door hung open, creaking in the wind. Papers were scattered across the porch, and one of the windows had been broken. It was clear that someone had searched the place thoroughly. Maggie dismounted and walked slowly toward the cabin, her heart hammering. This had been Uncle Jeremiah's home, and now it was hers, or would be, if she could hold on to it. The inside was in shambles. Furniture had been overturned, drawers pulled out and emptied, books scattered across the floor. Someone had been looking for something specific. What do you think they were after? She asked. Cole picked up a torn piece of paper from the floor, studying it in the fading light. Probably the deed to the mine. Or maybe survey maps showing exactly where the copper veins run. He crumpled the paper and let it fall. Your uncle was smart, though. He never kept important documents where someone could easily find them. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the desert. Cole was at the window in an instant, peering out through the broken glass. We've got company. Half a dozen riders coming in fast. Maggie felt her throat tighten with fear, but she forced herself to remain calm. Hawthorne's men? Most likely. Cole checked his guns with practiced efficiency. You need to get somewhere safe. There's a root cellar behind the cabin. I'm not hiding. The sharpness in her voice made him turn. Maggie stood in the center of the ransacked room, her small hands clenched into fists, her chin raised in defiance. The afternoon light streaming through the broken window caught the determination in her dark eyes. Miss Thornfield, these aren't men who'll be impressed by your courage. Then they'll have to learn to be. Before Cole could respond, the riders burst into the clearing. The lead horseman was a mountain of a man with shoulders like a bull and a face scarred by years of violence. Dutch Morrison, Maggie realized, remembering the stable keeper's description. Behind him rode 5 others, all hard-faced and armed to the teeth. Morrison dismounted with surprising grace for such a large man and strode toward the cabin. Well, he called out in a voice like grinding gravel. Look what the cat dragged in. Cole Mackenzie and the Little Eastern Princess. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Cole stepped onto the porch, his hands resting lightly on his gun butts. Dutch, still doing Hawthorne's dirty work, I see. Morrison's laugh was ugly. At least I know which side my bread's buttered on, unlike some folks. His small, pig-like eyes shifted to Maggie, who had appeared in the doorway beside Cole. You must be Jaramir's niece. Pretty little thing, ain't you? Too bad you came all this way for nothing. This is my property, Maggie said, her voice steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins. I have the legal papers to prove it. Legal papers don't mean much out here, little girl. What matters is who's strong enough to hold what they claim. Morrison gestured to his men, who began to spread out in a semicircle. Now Mr. Hawthorne's prepared to make you a very generous offer for this mine. More money than you'd see in a lifetime back east. I'm not interested in selling. Morrison's expression darkened. That's unfortunate. See, your uncle thought the same way, and look how that turned out for him. The threat was unmistakable. Cole's hand moved a fraction closer to his gun, and the tension in the air became almost palpable. Maggie could feel the weight of 6 pairs of eyes on her, measuring her, waiting to see if she would break. Instead, she stepped forward, putting herself between Cole and Morrison despite the danger. Are you saying you had something to do with my uncle's death? Morrison's grin revealed tobacco-stained teeth. I'm saying accidents happen to folks who don't know when to be reasonable. Your uncle had a bad fall, hit his head on a rock. Could happen to anyone, especially someone as delicate as yourself. You son of a... Cole started forward, but Maggie's hand on his arm stopped him. Let me handle this, she said quietly, then looked directly at Morrison. Tell Mr. Hawthorne that I'm not my uncle, and I'm certainly not afraid of him or his threats. Morrison's face flushed red with anger. You little... He took a step toward her, his massive fist raised. What happened next surprised everyone, including Maggie herself. Years of working in the steel mills, of carrying heavy loads and enduring harsh conditions, had given her a strength that her appearance belied. As Morrison reached for her, she sidestepped with fluid grace and brought her knee up hard into his stomach. The big man doubled over, gasping for breath. His men reached for their guns, but Cole's revolvers were already in his hands, the barrels tracking from one target to another with deadly precision. I wouldn't, he said conversationally, unless you want to explain to Hawthorne why half is. Crew ended up in the ground. Morrison straightened slowly, his face purple with rage and humiliation. You little witch, he snarled at Maggie. You'll regret this. The only thing I regret, Maggie replied calmly, is that I didn't hit you harder. For a moment, it seemed as though Morrison might try to rush her again, but one of his men grabbed his arm. Dutch, we need to get back to the boss. He's going to want to hear about this. Morrison allowed himself to be led back to his horse, but his eyes never left Maggie's face. "This ain't over, Princess." Not by a long shot. They mounted up and rode off in a cloud of dust, but their parting words lingered in the air like a curse. Maggie watched them go, her heart still pounding but her expression resolute. Cole holstered his guns and turned to study her with new respect. That was either very brave or very foolish, maybe both. Maggie brushed the dust from her skirt and looked around at the ransacked cabin. "But I meant what I said. I'm not afraid of them." "You should be. Dutch Morrison's killed 3 men that I know of, and Hawthorne's got enough money and influence to make problems disappear." Cole paused. "Including people. Then I'll have to be very careful not to disappear." Maggie walked back into the cabin and began picking up the scattered papers. "This is my home now, Mr. Mackenzie, my inheritance, and I intend to fight for it." Cole watched her for a long moment, noting the determined set of her shoulders and the way she moved with unconscious efficiency despite her petite frame. There was something about Magnolia Thornfield that didn't match her appearance, a core of steel beneath the silk and lace. "Your uncle kept a shotgun behind the door," he said finally. "Might want to check if it's still there." It was, along with a box of shells. Maggie hefted the weapon, testing its weight and balance. Cole raised an eyebrow when she broke it open with practiced ease, checking the action and examining the firing. "Pins, you know your way around a gun." "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. Said a woman needed to be able to protect herself." Maggie snapped the shotgun closed and set it aside. Course, he was thinking more about the rough neighborhoods in Pittsburgh than armed cowboys in the Arizona desert. As the sun began to set behind Thunder Mesa, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Maggie and Cole worked together to restore some order to the cabin. It was modest but well built, with thick adobe walls and sturdy furniture that had withstood both the search and the years. Uncle Jeremiah had clearly been a man who appreciated quality and durability. "Tell me about my uncle," Maggie said as they worked. "What kind of man was he?" Cole paused in his task of righting an overturned chair, honest to a fault. "Stubborn as a mule when he thought he was right. He came out here 20 years ago with nothing but a pickaxe and a dream, and he made something of himself through pure grit." He gestured toward the mine entrance. "That mountain gave up its copper grudgingly, but Jeremiah never gave up on it." "Why did Hawthorne want the mine so badly?" "Water rights, mostly. Control of Thunder Mesa means control of the only reliable water source for 50 miles in any direction. With the railroad coming through, that water's going to be worth more than all the copper in the mountain." Cole's expression grew grim. "Hawthorne's been buying up land all along the proposed route. He aims to have a monopoly on everything the railroad needs: water, grazing land, mineral rights. And one small mine was all that stood in his way. Your uncle's land sits right in the middle of Hawthorne's planned empire. Without it, his whole scheme falls apart." Cole met her eyes. "That's why he'll do anything to get it, including murder." The weight of the situation settled on Maggie's shoulders like a physical burden. She was one woman alone against a powerful man with unlimited resources and no scruples about how he used them. The sensible thing would be to take whatever money Hawthorne offered and return to Pennsylvania. But as she looked around the cabin, at Uncle Jeremiah's books on the shelves, his coffee cup still sitting on the table, the family photograph showing a younger version of her father standing next to a man who could only be Jeremiah, she felt something kindle inside her chest. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about family, about legacy, about refusing to let bullies have their way simply because they were stronger. "I'll need to learn everything I can about running a mine," she said finally. Cole blinked. In surprise, "You're staying?" "I'm staying." Maggie's voice grew stronger with each word. "This is my home now. My inheritance, and I'll be damned if I let Rex Hawthorne steal it from me." Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, its cry echoing off the walls of Thunder Mesa, The sound was wild and lonesome, but it didn't frighten Maggie. If anything, it reminded her that survival in this harsh land required more than just strength. It required cunning, determination, and the willingness to fight for what was yours. As night fell over the desert, Maggie Thornfield stood at the window of her uncle's cabin, looking out at the mine that was now hers to defend. She might look weak to men like Dutch Morrison and Rex Hawthorne, but appearances could be deceiving. Tomorrow, the real test would begin. Dawn broke, cold and harsh. Over Thunder Mesa, the desert air carrying a bite that made Maggie's breath visible as she stepped outside the cabin. She'd spent a restless night listening to every sound, the shotgun propped against her bed within easy reach. Cole had insisted on sleeping in the mine office, positioning himself between her and any potential threat approaching from the main trail. The mine shaft yawned before her like a mouth carved into the mountain itself, its depths lost in shadow despite the growing daylight. Wooden support beams framed the entrance, and rusted rail tracks disappeared into the darkness where ore cars had once carried copper to the surface. This was her legacy: tons of rock and the promise of wealth buried beneath layers of stone and earth. Morning, Cole's voice startled her from behind. He emerged from the office building, his hair still tousled from sleep, but his eyes alert and scanning the horizon. Sleep any? Some. Maggie adjusted her work dress. She'd changed from her traveling clothes into something more practical, though even her most rugged outfit seemed delicate compared to Cole's worn leather and denim. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday. About the water rights. Cole nodded toward a wooden structure about 50 yards from the mine entrance. Your uncle built that cistern to collect rainwater, but the real source is deeper. There's a natural spring inside the mine, about 200 feet down. It's what made this location so valuable in the first place. They walked together toward the mine entrance, their footsteps echoing off the rock walls. Maggie peered into the darkness, trying to imagine her uncle spending years of his life in these tunnels, chipping away at the mountain one day at a time. The air flowing from the depths carried a metallic scent, mixed with dampness and something else, the smell of deep earth undisturbed by sunlight. How much copper is still down there? Hard to say. Jeremiah was always secretive about his yields, but he was still pulling decent ore when he died. The main vein runs along a fault line that cuts deep into the mesa. Cole picked up a lantern from a hook beside the entrance and lit it with a match. Want to take a look? The descent into the mine was like entering another world. The circle of daylight above them shrank to a distant star as they followed the rail tracks deeper into the mountain. Cole's lantern cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, revealing tool marks where Uncle Jeremiah had carved his way through solid rock. Side passages branched off from the main tunnel, some blocked by cave-ins, others disappearing into impenetrable darkness. He worked this mine alone? Maggie asked, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Mostly, hired day labor when he needed to move heavy equipment or blast through particularly hard rock, but Jeremiah preferred to keep his business private. Cole stopped at a junction where the tunnel split in 3 directions. Smart man. The fewer people who knew exactly how much copper he was pulling out, the better. They took the leftmost passage, following it for another 100 yards until they reached a natural chamber where the sound of dripping water grew stronger. Cole raised the lantern, illuminating a pool of clear water that reflected the flame. Like a mirror, steam rose from its surface, indicating the presence of a hot spring. This is what Hawthorne really wants, Cole said. Not just the copper, but this water. In a drought year, this spring is the difference between life and death for anyone running cattle in this territory. Maggie knelt beside the pool and dipped her fingers into the warm water. It was clean and sweet, without the alkaline taste common to desert wells. She could understand why Hawthorne coveted it. Control of this water meant control of the entire region's livestock industry. How many people know about this? Too many. Word gets around in a small territory, especially when money's involved. Cole's expression grew troubled. There's something else you need to know. Hawthorne's been spreading rumors in town that your uncle's death wasn't accidental. Maggie looked up sharply. What kind of rumors? The kind that suggest you might have had something to do with it. Amazing how fast gossip travels when there's money behind it. Cole's jaw tightened. He's trying to turn the town against you before you can establish yourself. Make it seem like you're not the rightful heir. The implications hit Maggie like a physical blow. If Hawthorne succeeded in casting doubt on her legitimacy, he could tie up the inheritance in legal challenges for years. Meanwhile, he'd have free rein to exploit the water rights and gradually take control of the property through bureaucratic manipulation. Can he do that? Legally, I mean? Out here, legal and practical aren't always the same thing. If enough people believe his version of events, the territorial judge might be persuaded to freeze the inheritance pending investigation. Cole extinguished the lantern as they began the climb back to the surface. Hawthorne's got connections in the territorial capital. Judges who owe him favors. They emerged from the mine to find 3 horsemen waiting in the clearing. Maggie's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol she'd strapped to her waist. Another of Uncle Jeremy's possessions she'd claimed for protection. But these weren't Hawthorne's men. The lead rider was a woman in her 50s, weathered by years under the desert sun, but sitting on her horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. She wore practical riding clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that cast her face in shadow. Behind her rode 2 younger men who had the lean, efficient look of working cowboys. Miss Thornfield? The woman's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'm Victoria Blackwood. I own the Circle B Ranch about 20 miles north of here. Maggie had heard the name Blackwood was one of the few ranchers in the territory who'd managed to maintain independence from Hawthorne's expanding empire. She dismounted and approached cautiously, uncertain whether this was friend or foe. Mrs. Blackwood, what brings you to Thunder Mesa? Trouble, mostly. Victoria's weathered face was grim. Same trouble that's been plaguing honest folks all over this territory. Rex Hawthorne's got his sights set on every piece of land between here and the Colorado River, and he's not particular about how he gets it. One of the younger men, a redhead with freckles and an earnest expression, spoke up. Ma'am, we heard about what happened yesterday. Dutch Morrison and his crew riding out here to intimidate you. He touched his hat brim. I'm Billy Sawyer, and this here's my brother Tom. We work for Mrs. Blackwood. More than that, Victoria corrected. These boys are like sons to me. Their father was my late husband's partner before Hawthorne drove him off his land. Her expression hardened. He died broke and bitter, but not before he made me promise to look after his boys. Cole stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. Victoria. Been a while. Cole Mackenzie. Her tone was neutral, but Maggie caught the tension beneath it. Heard you were back in the territory. Some folks aren't too happy about that. Some folks never were happy about much of anything. Cole's smile was thin. What's your interest in Miss Thornfield's situation? Victoria's gaze shifted between Cole and Maggie, evaluating. Same as it's always been. I believe in people's right to hold what's theirs without being terrorized by men like Rex Hawthorne. She paused. Your uncle was a good neighbor, Miss Thornfield. He helped me through some difficult times when my husband died. I owe his memory that much. And Hawthorne's been pressuring you too. Every rancher in the territory felt his pressure. He's been buying up water rights, blocking access to traditional grazing areas, using legal challenges to tie up property transfers. Victoria's voice carried years of frustration. The man's like a spider, spinning a web that gets tighter every day. Tom Sawyer, the darker-haired brother, spoke for the first time. He made an offer on our ranch last month. When Mrs. Blackwood refused, Someone poisoned half our cattle at the North Waterhole. The casual way he said it sent a chill down Maggie's spine. Poisoned? Arsenic in the water. Killed 30 head of prime beef cattle. Victoria's hands tightened on her reins. Sheriff wouldn't investigate, said there was no proof it was intentional. But that waterhole had been clean for 20 years, until the day after I refused Hawthorne's offer. Maggie felt the weight of the situation settling around her like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just about her inheritance, it was about a pattern of intimidation and violence that had been building for years. Standing up to Hawthorne meant standing up for every small landowner who'd been pushed around by his organization. What do you propose we do about it? Victoria's weathered face split in a grim smile. We stand together. Hawthorne's used to picking off isolated targets one at a time. But if the independent ranchers and miners unite, present a unified front, he might think twice about his tactics. You're talking about a range war, Cole observed quietly. I'm talking about self-defense. There's a difference. Victoria gestured toward the mine entrance. Your uncle understood that. He was working with several of us to form a cooperative, pooling our resources to fight Hawthorne's legal challenges and providing mutual protection against his hired guns. What happened to that plan? Died with Jeremiah. Without the mines, water rights and the copper revenues, the cooperative couldn't survive financially. Victoria's eyes met Maggie's directly. But if you're willing to take up where your uncle left off. The offer hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Maggie understood the implications. Aligning herself with Victoria Blackwood meant declaring open war against Rex Hawthorne. It meant abandoning any possibility of a peaceful resolution and committing herself to a fight that could cost her everything, including her life. But as she thought about Uncle Jeremiah working alone in the darkness of the mine, chipping away at solid rock with nothing but determination and hope, she felt something harden inside her chest. This land was her inheritance, bought with her uncle's sweat and blood. She wouldn't let a bully take it without a fight. What would this cooperative involve? Shared intelligence about Hawthorne's movements, mutual defense agreements, combined legal representation. Victoria counted the points on her fingers. Most importantly, unified resistance to his intimidation tactics. When he threatens one of us, he threatens all of us. Billy Sawyer leaned forward in his saddle. Miss, there's something else you should know. Word around town is that Hawthorne's planning something big. He's brought in more men from Texas gunfighters, not cowboys. The kind of men who solve problems with bullets instead of words. How many men? Maybe a dozen so far, but more arriving. Every week. They're camping outside town, calling themselves security consultants. Tom's expression was troubled. Sheriff's doing nothing about it. Claims they haven't broken any laws. Cole's face had gone stone cold. Security consultants. That's what they're calling hired killers these days. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A single rider appeared on the trail from town, pushing his horse hard across the desert floor. As he drew closer, Maggie could see it was an older man in a dusty suit, his face flushed with heat and exertion. That's Henry Walsh, Victoria said. Owns the bank in Copper Ridge. The plan they developed was audacious in its simplicity. At midnight, when Morrison's sentries would be fighting sleep, they would stage a noisy departure, saddling horses, loading supplies, arguing loudly about retreat and defeat. The goal was to convince Morrison that Maggie had been frightened into abandoning her claim, but instead of leaving, they would circle back through the maze of arroyos and rock formations that surrounded Thunder Mesa, approaching the mine from an unexpected direction. While Morrison's men relaxed their guard, thinking the threat had passed, a small team would infiltrate the mine itself and secure the water source. Control the spring, control the leverage, Victoria explained. Hawthorne wants this land for the water rights. If we can demonstrate that we're still capable of defending our interests, it might force him to negotiate. The hours until midnight crawled by with agonizing slowness. Maggie found herself checking and rechecking her weapons, running through the plan repeatedly, trying to anticipate everything that could go wrong. The list was long and troubling. At 11:30, they began their performance. Victoria's voice carried clearly across the clearing as she argued with Cole about the wisdom of retreat. "This is madness. We're outnumbered 4-1. The girl's got spirit, I'll give her that," Cole replied loudly. "But spirit don't stop." Bullets. Maggie played her part perfectly, allowing tears to creep into her voice as she supposedly pleaded with Victoria to help her escape. "I can't do this anymore. I thought I was strong enough, but I'm not. Please help me get away from here." Morrison's camp stirred at the commotion. Maggie could see figures moving between the fires, listening to every word. The big foreman himself emerged from his tent, standing with arms crossed as he watched their supposed retreat preparation. They loaded their horses with obvious supplies: bedrolls, saddlebags bulging with provisions, even Uncle Jeremy's strongbox that supposedly contained important papers. Tom Sawyer made a show of helping Maggie into her saddle, her shoulders shaking with manufactured sobs. "You made the right choice, miss," he said loudly enough for Morrison's men to hear. "This ain't no place for a lady." They rode out slowly, heads down in apparent defeat, following the main trail toward Copper Ridge. Behind them, Maggie could hear Morrison's men celebrating their victory with renewed laughter and the clink of whiskey bottles. But once they were out of sight beyond the first ridge, the group split according to plan. Henry Walsh continued toward town with the pack horses and obvious supplies, maintaining the illusion of retreat. The rest of them dismounted and led their horses off the trail into a narrow canyon that wound back toward Thunder Mesa through terrain too rough for casual observation. The night air was sharp with the scent of sage and creosote, and overhead the stars provided just enough light to navigate by. They moved in single file, Victoria leading because she knew the country best, each rider maintaining contact with the one ahead through whispered signals and gentle touches. It took 2 hours to circle back to their target, a natural chimney in the rock face that connected to the mine's lower levels through a series of caves Uncle Jeremy had discovered but never mapped. Cole had explored it briefly during his earlier reconnaissance, pronouncing it dangerous but passable for someone small and agile. "This is where we find out if your uncle's engineering was as good as his mining," Cole whispered as they secured their horses in a hidden grove. The chimney was a vertical crack in the mesa's face, barely wide enough for Maggie's shoulders. Ancient handholds had been carved into the rock, probably by Apache hunters generations earlier, but time and weather had worn them smooth. One slip would mean a fatal fall onto the jagged rocks below. "I should go first," Billy offered. "I'm lighter than the rest of you." "No." Maggie was already testing the first handhold. "If anyone gets stuck or falls, it should be me. This is my responsibility." The climb was a nightmare of aching muscles and controlled terror. Each handhold had to be tested carefully before trusting it with her full weight, and the darkness made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Twice, crumbling rock nearly sent her plummeting into the void below. But Uncle Jeremy's engineering proved sound. The chimney connected to a horizontal passage that led directly into the mine's lower workings, emerging near the underground. Spring. Maggie felt cool, humid air on her face as she crawled through the final stretch of tunnel, and the sound of dripping water grew stronger with each foot of progress. She emerged into the chamber they had visited that morning, though it looked entirely different by lamplight. The spring pool reflected her flickering flame like a mirror, and the cave walls sparkled with mineral deposits that Uncle Jeremy had left undisturbed. This was the heart of the mountain, the source of life that made everything else possible. One by one, her companions joined her in the chamber. Cole arrived last, his usually neat appearance disheveled from the crawl through narrow passages. "Well, he said quietly. "We're in." Now what? The question hung in the damp air like smoke. Getting into the mine had been the easy part. Now they had to figure out how to use their position to maximum advantage. Morrison's men controlled the main entrance and had legal authority backing their presence. Simply occupying the spring chamber wasn't enough to shift the balance of power. "We need proof," Maggie realized. "Evidence that Hawthorne's claims are fraudulent." Victoria nodded toward the mine office above them. "Your uncle's records. The real financial documents that would show whether he actually owed Hawthorne money." Morrison's men searched the office thoroughly. If there were incriminating papers, they would have found them. Not necessarily. Cole was studying the chamber walls with renewed interest. Jeremiah was paranoid about security. He might have hidden important documents where casual searchers wouldn't think to look. They spent the next hour examining every inch of the chamber, looking for signs of concealed compartments or hidden caches. It was Tom Sawyer who noticed the anomaly, a section of rock wall where the chisel marks ran in a different pattern than the surrounding stone. "This piece has been removed and replaced," he said, running his fingers along what looked like natural joints in the rock. "Recently, too. You can see where fresh tool marks cut through the old ones." Cole produced a pry bar from his pack end, carefully worked it into the gaps Tom had identified. With a grinding sound that echoed through the chamber, a section of wall swung inward on concealed hinges, revealing a cavity large enough to hold several document cases. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather against the humidity, they found Uncle Jeremiah's real records. Bank statements, correspondence with mining equipment suppliers, contracts with ore buyers, everything that documented his actual financial situation. And most importantly, a detailed journal where he had recorded every business transaction for the past 5 years. "Listen to this," Maggie said, reading by lamplight from the journal's final entries. "Hawthorne made 3 separate offers to buy the mine. The last one was for $50,000, which Uncle Jeremiah refused. But there's no mention anywhere of borrowing money from Hawthorne or anyone else." Victoria examined the bank statements with a practiced eye. "Your uncle was actually quite prosperous. These deposits show regular income from ore sales, and his account balance was substantial at the time of his death." Then the promissory notes Morrison showed the judge have to be forgeries. "Proving that in court is a different matter," Cole observed grimly. "Hawthorne's got enough money to buy expert testimony that would authenticate almost any document." Billy was studying a letter from the bottom of the stack, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Miss Thornfield, you need to see this." The letter was addressed to Uncle Jeremiah and dated just 2 weeks before his death. The letterhead bore the seal of a major mining corporation based in San Francisco, and the contents made Maggie's blood run cold. "Mr. Thornfield, our geological survey of the Thunder Mesa region has confirmed deposits of significantly greater value than previously estimated. The copper ore represents only a fraction of the mountain's mineral wealth. Recent assay techniques have revealed substantial deposits of silver and traces of gold in formations previously thought to be worthless. We are prepared to increase our previous offer by a factor of 10, contingent upon immediate acceptance and transfer of all mineral rights. Time is of the essence, as we have reason to believe other parties are aware of these findings. Your prompt response is appreciated. Respectfully, Harrison and Associates Mining Consultants." The implications were staggering. Uncle Jeremiah hadn't just owned a modest copper mine, he had controlled mineral rights to a deposit worth potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. No wonder Hawthorne had been so determined to acquire the property, and so willing to resort to extreme measures when legal purchase failed. "This changes everything," Victoria breathed. "We're not just fighting for a small mine anymore. We're fighting for one of the richest mineral deposits in the territory." A sudden sound from above froze them all in place, heavy footsteps echoing through the mine tunnels. accompanied by the murmur of voices and the scrape of boots on stone. Morrison's men were conducting a nighttime patrol of the mine workings. Cole extinguished the lantern instantly, plunging them into absolute darkness. The footsteps grew closer, and they could hear individual voices now, rough men discussing guard rotations and complaining about the cold. "Told you this place gives me the creeps," one voice grumbled. "All these tunnels and shadows. A man could get lost down here and never find his way out." "Morrison says we check every passage twice a night," another replied. "Orders from the big man himself. Can't afford to let anyone slip past us." The voices were almost directly overhead now, in the main tunnel that connected to their chamber. If the patrol decided to investigate the side passages thoroughly, they would be trapped with nowhere to run. Maggie felt Cole's hand find hers in the darkness, his grip steady and reassuring. Around her, she could sense her companions frozen in absolute stillness, barely breathing as the patrol continued its rounds. "You hear that?" The first voice had stopped, and Maggie's heart hammered as she realized he might have detected some sound from their hiding place. "Hear what? Thought I heard something. Like voices, maybe." There was a long pause filled with the sound of men listening intently. Maggie pressed herself against the cave wall, trying to become invisible, the precious documents clutched against her chest. "Just the wind through the tunnels," the second voice decided. "This whole mountain's full of strange sounds. Come on, let's finish the circuit and get back to the fire." The footsteps resumed, gradually fading as the patrol moved deeper into the mine. But the encounter had driven home their vulnerability. They were trapped in enemy territory with evidence that could expose Hawthorne's entire scheme, but no way to get that evidence to anyone who could act on it. "We need to get word to Henry Walsh," Maggie whispered when she was sure the patrol had passed. "These documents prove Hawthorne's claims are fraudulent. Walsh is probably halfway to town by now," Tom pointed out. "And even if we could reach him, Morrison's got men watching all the approaches. Then we go to them." Victoria's voice carried a note of desperate determination. "Create enough commotion to draw their attention while someone slips out with the evidence. That's suicide," Cole protested. "Morrison's got professional killers up there. They're not going to be distracted by noise and gunfire. They're going to respond with overwhelming force." But Maggie was already working through the possibilities in her mind. The patrol schedule, the layout of the mine, the positioning of Morrison's camp. There had to be a weakness they could exploit, a moment of vulnerability that would allow them to turn the tables. "What if we didn't try to slip past them?" she said slowly. "What if we made them come to us?" The plan that emerged was dangerous to the point of madness, but it was also their only realistic chance of success. Using the mine's complex tunnel system, they would create the illusion of a much larger force moving through the workings. Voices echoing from multiple passages, lamplight glimpsed in different locations, the sound of many people moving through the depths of the mountain. Morrison's men would have to split their forces to investigate, and in the confusion, one person might be able to slip out through the original entrance with the incriminating documents. It would require precise timing and more than a little luck, but it was possible. "Who carries the papers out?" Billy asked. Doggy looked around at her companions, measuring their different strengths and weaknesses. Cole was the best fighter, but also the most recognizable to Morrison's men. Victoria was tough and experienced, but not particularly fast. The Sawyer brothers were young and quick, but might panic under pressure. "I do," she said finally. "It's my mine, my inheritance, my responsibility." "Absolutely not," Cole said flatly. "You're the one they're really after. Morrison sees you, and this whole thing falls apart. Then I'll make sure he doesn't see me." Maggie's voice carried a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I know these tunnels better than anyone now, and I'm small enough to use passages that would trap a larger person." The argument continued in fierce whispers for several minutes, but eventually even Cole had to admit that Maggie's plan made sense. She was the least likely to be recognized at a distance, and her size would allow her to use escape routes that would be impossible for the others. As they prepared to implement their desperate strategy, Maggie felt the weight of Uncle Jeremy's legacy settling around her shoulders like a cloak. Everything he had worked for, everything he had died protecting, now depended on her ability to slip past professional killers and reach safety with the evidence that could expose Hawthorne's corruption. The little girl from Pittsburgh, who had arrived just days earlier, was gone, replaced by someone harder and more determined. Someone who understood that appearing weak could be the greatest strength of all. In the darkness of the mine, surrounded by enemies and with everything at stake, Maggie Thornfield prepared to prove just how dangerous an underestimated woman could be. The deception began at 2 in the morning, when the desert cold had settled deep into men's bones, and even the most disciplined sentries fought the pull of sleep. Maggie clutched Uncle Jeremy's documents against her chest as Cole and the Sawyer brothers disappeared into different tunnel systems, each carrying a lantern and instructions to create maximum confusion with minimum actual contact. Victoria remained with her in the spring chamber, armed with a rifle and enough ammunition to hold off a small army if their plan went catastrophically wrong. The older woman's weathered face was calm in the lamplight, but Maggie could see the tension in her shoulders as she checked her weapon one final time. "Remember," Victoria whispered, "give us exactly 10 minutes to get their attention focused on the tunnels, then make your move. Don't hesitate, don't look back, and don't try to be a hero if something goes wrong." Maggie nodded, though her throat felt too tight for words. The weight of everything, Uncle Jeremy's legacy, the mine's true value, the lives of everyone who had chosen to stand with her, pressed down like a physical burden. If she failed, it wouldn't just mean losing her inheritance. It would mean watching Hawthorne's corruption spread unchecked across the entire territory. The first sounds of their ruse echoed through the mine workings exactly on schedule. Cole's voice, amplified and distorted by the tunnels, seemed to come from everywhere. At once, as he called out fake instructions to imaginary companions. "Jenkins, take your men through the North Passage. Rodriguez, cover the main shaft." Billy's lantern appeared briefly in a distant tunnel mouth, visible from the main entrance where Morrison's sentries were posted. Tom created the sound of multiple footsteps by dragging chains across the stone floor, the metallic scraping echoing ominously through the interconnected passages. The reaction from Morrison's camp was swift and violent. Shouts erupted from the surface as men scrambled for weapons and positions. Heavy boots thundered toward the mine entrance, and Maggie could hear Morrison's distinctive bellow cutting through the chaos. "They're in the mine! Get down there and flush them out. I want every tunnel searched." Through a crack in the rock wall, Maggie watched torch-bearing figures pour into the main shaft. Morrison himself led the charge, his massive frame silhouetted against the flickering light as he barked orders to his men. The professional killers Hawthorne had hired moved with military precision, splitting into teams and advancing methodically into the tunnel system. Now, Victoria breathed, and Maggie was already moving. The route she had chosen was a nightmare of narrow passages and vertical climbs, but it was also the one path Morrison's men were least likely to discover quickly. Uncle Jeremy had used it as an emergency escape route, carving handholds into the rock and installing rope anchors at critical points. It connected to a natural chimney that emerged behind a boulder field, well away from Morrison's main camp. Maggie extinguished her lamp and began the ascent in total darkness, feeling her way by touch alone. The documents were secured in an oiled leather satchel strapped across her back, but their bulk made maneuvering through tight spaces even more difficult. Behind her, the sounds of the search grew more frantic as Morrison's men encountered Cole's deceptions. "There, I saw movement in the East Passage." "That's just shadows, you fool. Check the side tunnels." "Where the hell are they?" "There's supposed to be a whole gang down here." Maggie smiled grimly as she hauled herself up another section of rock face. Cole's reputation as a dangerous man was working in their favor. Morrison's team expected to encounter a small army of gunfighters, not 4 people with lanterns creating elaborate sound effects. But as she neared the surface, something went wrong. The rope anchor that should have been at the 60-foot mark was missing, leaving her stranded on a narrow ledge with no way to continue upward. Below, the sounds of pursuit were growing closer as Morrison's men began to systematically search every passage and chamber. It was only a matter of time before they discovered the spring chamber and realized how they'd been deceived. Maggie pressed herself against the rock wall and tried to think. The nearest alternative route would take her back down into the tunnel system, directly into the path of Morrison's search teams. The shaft above her was too smooth to climb without equipment, and any noise she made trying would echo directly to the men below. Then she heard something that made her blood freeze, touch Morrison's voice, much closer than it should have been, coming from a passage she hadn't known existed. "Told you I heard something up here. Fresh air means there's another way out. Boss, the boys are still chasing ghosts in the main tunnels. Maybe you should shut up and follow orders. If there's a back way out of this mine, I want it found and sealed. Nobody leaves this mountain without my say-so." The beam of a torch appeared in the passage below Maggie's position, growing brighter as Morrison and his companion approached her hiding spot. In seconds, they would be directly beneath her, and even the slightest movement would give her away. Maggie pressed herself as flat as possible against the rock wall, hardly daring to breathe. The documents felt like they weighed 100 pounds, and she was terrified that the leather satchel would scrape against stone and betray her position. Morrison emerged into the chamber beneath her ledge, his torch held high as he examined the walls and ceiling. His companion, a wiry man with the quick movements of a ferret, began checking for handholds and climbing routes. "This goes all the way to the surface," the ferret-faced man reported. "See those anchor points? Someone's been using this route regular like Jeremy's back door," Morrison growled. "Shoulda known the old fool would have an escape route carved out. Probably how they got into the mine in the first place." Morrison raised his torch higher, and Maggie felt the heat from the flame wash over her face. She was barely 15 feet above him, and if he looked up at the right angle, boss. The Figu shout came from deeper in the mine, echoing through the passages with urgent intensity. "We found something." Morrison lowered the torch and turned toward the sound. "What is it?" "Hidden chamber behind the spring. Papers everywhere. Looks like Jeremy's private office." Morrison's curse echoed off the walls as he realized their deception. "They got past us somehow. Probably took whatever they were after and ran." He looked up one more time, his small eyes scanning the darkness above, but the angle was wrong, and Maggie remained invisible in the shadows. "Come on," he snarled to his companion. "If they're still in these tunnels, we'll find them. And when we do..." The threat hung in the air as Morrison's footsteps faded back into the mine's depths. Maggie waited until she was certain they were gone, then began the most difficult part of her escape, finding another way to the surface without ropes or anchor points. The climb took an hour of careful work, using techniques her father had taught her during their trips to the Pennsylvania quarries. She wedged herself into cracks in the rock face, braced her feet against opposite walls, and inched upward one painful movement at a time. Her hands were bleeding by the time she reached the surface, and her dress was torn in a dozen places, but she had made it out, and the documents were safe. The boulder field where she emerged was less than a quarter-mile from Morrison's camp, close enough that she could see the torchlights moving frantically around the mine entrance. The search had expanded to the surface now, with teams of men combing the immediate area for signs of intruders. Maggie crawled through the rocks on her belly, using every bit of cover available as she worked her way toward the horses they had hidden in the grove. The documents seemed to rustle with every movement, and she was convinced that the sound would carry across the desert and bring Morrison's men running. She was halfway to the horses when disaster struck. A sentry she hadn't seen stepped out from behind a large boulder, his rifle already trained on her position. In the starlight, she could see his face clearly, a young man, probably not much older than herself, with nervous eyes and the uncertain stance of someone new to violence. "Don't move," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I got you covered." Maggie froze, her mind racing through possibilities. The young sentry was clearly inexperienced, but he had her dead to rights with a rifle at close range. One wrong move and everything would be over, not just for her, but for everyone depending on the information she carried. "Easy there," she said softly, raising her hand slowly. "I'm not armed. You're one of them that was in the mine. Morrison's been looking for you." The rifle wavered slightly in his grip. "Says you're dangerous. Do I look dangerous to you?" It was a calculated gamble, playing on her appearance and the young man's obvious inexperience. She could see him taking in her torn dress, her bleeding hands, her small frame that looked even more delicate in the starlight. You don't look like much," he admitted, though he kept the rifle trained on her. "But Morrison says a lot of things, most of them lies." Maggie took a careful step closer, her voice remaining soft and non-threatening. "What's your name?" Danny Carson." The admission seemed to slip out before he could stop it. "Danny, I'm Maggie Thornfield. This is my mine that Morrison's men are occupying illegally. My uncle died here, and I'm just trying to protect what he left me." She could see uncertainty flickering in the young man's eyes. Whatever Morrison had told his men about dangerous criminals and armed gangs, the reality of one small injured woman didn't match the story. "Morrison says you're trying to steal the mine from its rightful owner." "Morrison's lying to you, Danny, just like he's lying to everyone else." Maggie took another small step forward. "Did he tell you about the forged documents? About the water rights he's trying to steal? About the people he's killed to get what he wants?" The rifle was definitely wavering now, and Maggie pressed her advantage. "How much is Hawthorne paying you, Danny? $20 a month? 30? Do you know how much this mine is really worth?" He said. "We're just supposed to guard it until the legal stuff gets sorted out." "Legal?" Maggie laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Danny, there's nothing legal about armed men occupying someone else's property. You're not guards, you're thieves. And when this is over, you'll be the ones facing a judge, not me." She was close enough now to see sweat beading on the young man's forehead despite the cool night air. His finger was still on the trigger, but the rifle was pointed at the ground rather than at her chest. "My ma raised me to respect the law," Danny said uncertainly. "If you're really the legal owner ... then help me prove it." Maggie gestured toward the satchel across her back. "I've got documents that show exactly what Morrison and Hawthorne have been doing. Help me get these papers to town, and we can settle this the right way." For a moment, she thought she had convinced him. Danny's grip on the rifle relaxed, and he took a step back as if to let her pass. But then voices echoed across the boulder field, other sentries calling his name, asking for his position report. "Danny, you see anything over there?" The young man's face went white as he realized the choice he had to make. Help a woman who claimed to be the rightful owner, or stick with the men who were paying his wages and might kill him for betraying. Then fear won out over conscience. "Over here!" Danny shouted, raising his rifle again. "I got one of them." Maggie didn't wait to see the result. She spun and ran, using the boulder field's chaotic terrain to break line of sight as Danny's rifle cracked behind her. The bullet sparked off rock inches from her head, but then she was around a corner and sprinting through the darkness toward the hidden horses. Behind her, the entire camp exploded into activity. Torchlights bobbed and weaved as Morrison's men converged on Danny's position, and she could hear the big foreman's bellow cutting through the night air. Which way did she go? Toward the horse's boss, She was carrying something. Cut her off. Don't let her reach town. Maggie burst into the grove where they had hidden their mounts to find Cole already there, throwing saddles onto horses with frantic efficiency. His clothes were torn and there was blood on his face, but his pale eyes were calm as he worked. "Time to go," he said without looking up. "Victoria and the boys are right behind me, but Morrison's men are coming fast." "How did you, later?" Cole boosted her into the saddle of her mare and slapped the animal's rump. "Ride for town. Don't stop for anything." The chase that followed was a nightmare of pounding hooves and gunfire echoing across the desert. Morrison had mounted his best men on their fastest horses, and they pursued with the grim determination of men who knew their own lives depended on stopping Maggie from reaching civilization. She rode low in the saddle, trusting her mare's sure footing as they raced across broken ground in near total darkness. Behind her, muzzle flashes lit up the night like deadly fireflies, and bullets whined overhead with the sound of angry hornets. Cole appeared beside her, his black stallion matching her mare's pace effortlessly. "There's a shortcut through Devil's Canyon," he shouted over the thundering hooves. "Dangerous in the dark, but it's our only chance to reach the town ahead of them." Victoria and the Sawyer brothers were somewhere behind them, their own pursuit lost in the darkness and confusion. Maggie could only hope they had escaped Morrison's net and were finding their own way to safety. Devil's Canyon was a slash in the earth barely wide enough for a horse and rider, with walls that rose 100 feet on either side. The path through it was treacherous even in daylight, with loose rock and sudden drop-offs that could cripple a horse or kill a rider. But it was also a shortcut that would take them directly to Copper Ridge while Morrison's men had to follow the longer, safer route. "Stay close," Cole warned as they plunged into the canyon's mouth. "Follow my horse exactly. One wrong step." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The canyon floor was littered with the bones of animals that had missed their footing over the years, white gleams in the starlight that served as grim reminders of the price of carelessness. They rode in single file through the winding passage, their horses' hooves echoing off the stone walls like gunshots. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had faded, but Maggie knew it was only temporary. Morrison would figure out their route eventually, and when he did, he would come after them with everything he had. The canyon seemed to stretch forever, a maze of twists and turns that led deeper into the heart of the mesa. Just when Maggie thought they might be lost, she saw a glimmer of light ahead, not stars, but the warm glow of oil lamps that meant civilization. They burst out of the canyon's far end to find themselves on the outskirts of Copper Ridge, the town's few buildings dark, except for the saloon and the sheriff's office. It was nearly dawn, and the eastern sky was beginning to show the first pale hints of sunrise. "The bank," Maggie gasped, her throat raw from the desert air. "We need to get these documents to Henry Walsh." But as they rode down the main street, something was wrong. Too many horses were tied up outside the saloon, and the sheriff's office was blazing with light despite the early hour. Groups of armed men stood in the shadows, their faces hidden but their intentions clear. "It's a trap," Cole said quietly. "Hawthorne's got men waiting for us." Maggie felt her heart sink as she realized the scope of Hawthorne's preparation. He hadn't just planned to steal her mine. He had anticipated every possible response and prepared countermeasures. Even if she had successfully escaped with the evidence, he had made sure there would be nowhere safe to take it. The crisis point had arrived, and it looked like Rex Hawthorne held all the cards. But as Maggie clutched the documents that proved his corruption, she reminded herself that appearances could be deceiving. She had spent her entire life being underestimated, and it was time to turn that weakness into her greatest strength. The real battle was just beginning. The pre-dawn streets of Copper Ridge stretched before them like a chessboard where every piece belonged to their enemy. Maggie counted at least a dozen armed men positioned strategically around the town center, their horses fresh and their weapons ready. Hawthorne hadn't just anticipated their escape, He had orchestrated a perfect ambush. "The telegraph office," Cole murmured, nodding toward a small building on the far side of the main street. "If we can get word to the territorial marshal in Flagstaff... Look again." Maggie pointed to two figures lounging outside the telegraph office, their casual poses failing to disguise the fact that they were armed and alert. Hawthorne's thought of everything. They retreated to an alley between the general store and the blacksmith shop, their horses breathing hard from the desperate ride through Devil's Canyon. The first rays of sunrise were painting the eastern mountains in shades of gold and crimson. But the beauty of the desert dawn felt mocking given their circumstances. "We can't stay here," Cole said, checking the loads in his revolvers. "Once Morrison figures out which route we took, he'll be here with his full crew. Then we'll be trapped between two forces." Maggie's mind raced through possibilities, each more desperate than the last. They had the evidence to expose Hawthorne's corruption, but no way to present it to anyone with the authority to act. The local sheriff was either bought or intimidated. The telegraph was monitored, and every route out of town was blocked. Then she remembered something Uncle Jeremiah had mentioned in his journal, a detail that might offer their only chance for salvation. "The railroad survey team," she said suddenly. "They're camped 15 miles north of here, mapping the route for the new line. They work for the territorial government, not for Hawthorne." Cole's pale eyes sharpened with interest. Railroad surveyors would have their own telegraph equipment and federal authority that supersedes local corruption. The problem is reaching them. Hawthorne's men control every obvious route north, and we can't outrun them across open desert. "Who says anything about outrunning them?" A new voice spoke from the shadows behind them, and both Maggie and Cole spun with weapons half drawn before recognizing Victoria Blackwood. The older woman emerged from the darkness between buildings, her clothes torn and her face streaked with dirt, but her eyes blazing with fierce determination. Behind her came Billy and Tom Sawyer, both looking worse for wear but very much alive. "How did you?" Maggie began. "Same way you did, just took a different route." Victoria gestured toward the maze of arroyos and gullies that surrounded the town. "Hawthorne's boys are good, but they're not miracle workers. Can't watch every rabbit trail in the territory." Billy was examining the positions of Hawthorne's men with the practiced eye of someone who had grown up hunting in a dangerous country. "They're spread thin," he observed. "Covering too much ground with too few men. Classic mistake." "Still too many for a direct assault," Tom added grimly. "And they've got the high ground." Victoria smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression. "Then we don't assault them directly. We make them come to us, on the ground of our choosing." The plan that emerged was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. Using the network of contacts Victoria had built over years of fighting Hawthorne's expansion, they would create multiple distractions throughout the territory, false reports of attacks on other properties, staged incidents that would force Hawthorne to spread his forces even thinner. Meanwhile, Maggie would use the one advantage no one expected: her appearance. Dressed as a traveling preacher's daughter seeking safe passage to the railroad camp, she would walk openly through town carrying the documents hidden in a Bible. The disguise would be almost insultingly simple, but sometimes the most obvious. Deceptions were the hardest to see through. "It's insane," Cole protested. "If they recognize you... they won't." Maggie's voice carried a confidence born of desperation and determination. "Look at me, really look. I'm exactly what every man in this territory expects to see. A helpless Eastern girl who needs protection from the big, dangerous West." She was right, and Cole knew it. Maggie's petite frame, her torn dress, her wide eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, everything about her appearance screamed victim rather than threat. It was the perfect camouflage for someone carrying evidence that could destroy a man's empire. "What about backup?" Billy asked. "If something goes wrong... Then you run," Maggie said flatly. Don't risk everyone for one person. Get word to the territorial marshal however you can, and let federal law handle the rest." Victoria studied her with new respect. "Your uncle would be proud." Jeremiah always said the strongest steel came from the hottest fires. As the sun climbed higher, they put their plan into motion. Victoria and the Sawyer brothers melted back into the desert, heading for predetermined positions where they would create carefully orchestrated chaos. Cole reluctantly agreed to circle wide around the town and approach the railroad camp from the north, ready to back up Maggie's story if she made it through. Left alone in the alley, Maggie began her transformation. She had found a traveling dress. In the general store's refuse pile, shabby but respectable, the kind of outfit a poor preacher's daughter might wear. Her hair, normally pinned up in Eastern fashion, she let fall loose around her shoulders, making her look even younger and more vulnerable. The Bible came from the same refuse pile, its leather cover worn smooth by countless hands. She carefully removed several pages from the middle and inserted Uncle Jeremiah's documents, then restitched the binding with thread pulled from her torn dress. To casual inspection, it would look like nothing more than a well-used book of scripture. The walk through town was the longest 100 yards of Maggie's life. She kept her eyes downcast and her pace unhurried, playing the part of a nervous young woman seeking help from strangers. Her heart hammered against her ribs with every step, but she forced her expression to remain meek and frightened. "Miss? You all right there?" The voice belonged to one of Hawthorne's sentries, a lean man with cold eyes and the quick movements of a professional gunfighter. He had stepped out from his position near the saloon, his hand resting casually on his gun. "But, oh, you startled me." Maggie clutched the Bible to her chest and took a nervous step backward. "I'm looking for someone who might help me reach the railroad camp. My father is the circuit preacher there, and I've gotten separated from our wagon train." The gunfighter's eyes traveled over her appearance, taking in the shabby dress, the frightened expression, the Bible that marked her as harmless religious folk. Everything he saw confirmed what he expected, just another Eastern pilgrim lost in a country too dangerous for her kind. "Railroad camp 15 miles north of here, miss. Dangerous country for a young lady traveling alone." His tone was patronizing, dismissive. "Might want to wait for the next supply wagon. When would that be?" "Few days, maybe a week. Depends on what the bosses decide." He was already losing interest, his attention shifting back to watching for real threats. "Mrs. Peterson at the boarding house might put you up until then." Maggie allowed tears to well up in her eyes, not difficult, given the stress of the situation. "I don't have money for a boarding house. Father's expecting me, and I promised I'd be there for Sunday services." The gunfighter shrugged, clearly considering her problems irrelevant to his duties. "Well, good luck to you then, miss. But I'd stay close to town if I were you. Lot of dangerous folks wandering the desert these days." He turned away, dismissing her as completely as if she had ceased to exist. Maggie continued walking, maintaining her frightened, helpless demeanor until she was well out of sight. Only then did she allow herself a small smile of satisfaction. The disguise was working perfectly. These men were so certain of their own superiority, so convinced that real threats came from other armed men, that they literally couldn't see danger in a small woman with a Bible. Their arrogance was her greatest weapon. The path north from Copper Ridge wound through a series of low hills covered with sage and mesquite. Maggie had walked perhaps 3 miles when she heard hoofbeats approaching from behind. She turned to see a single rider, not one of Hawthorne's men, but Sheriff Harlan himself, his badge glinting in the morning sun. "Miss Thornfield." His voice was carefully neutral as he reined in his horse. "Interesting outfit you've got there." Maggie's blood turned to ice. If the sheriff recognized her, if he was working with Hawthorne, "I'm sorry, sir. I think you have me confused with someone else. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and I'm trying to reach my father at the railroad camp." "Sheriff Harlan." studied her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then, to her amazement, he smiled, not the cold, calculating expression she expected from one of Hawthorne's allies, but something warmer and more genuine. "Sarah Mitchell, is it? Well, Miss Mitchell, you might be interested to know that I've been waiting 20 years for someone to bring me evidence against Rex Hawthorne that would stand up in a territorial court." The admission hit Maggie like a physical blow. "You're not working for him?" "Hell no." Harlan's expression darkened. "That snake's been buying judges and intimidating witnesses for years, but he's never owned me. Problem is, without proof of his crimes, my hands are tied by territorial law. And if someone were to provide such proof, then Rex Hawthorne would find himself on trial for conspiracy, fraud, intimidation, and quite possibly murder." Harlan's smile was grimmer now, with an edge of satisfaction that had been years in the making. Course, such evidence would have to be presented properly through official channels. Maggie felt hope stirring in her chest for the first time since leaving the mine. What would those official channels be? Federal Railroad inspectors do. On tomorrow's supply train. He's got authority to investigate any irregularities affecting the railroad's construction. And coincidentally, he's also a federal marshal with jurisdiction over territorial disputes. The pieces of a new plan began falling into place in Maggie's mind. This inspector, would he be interested in evidence that someone was using fraud and violence to manipulate land values along the rail route? Very interested, especially if that evidence came from a reliable witness who could testify to its authenticity. Harlan leaned forward in his saddle. "You wouldn't happen to know of such a witness, would you, Miss Mitchell?" "I might. But this witness would need protection from Hawthorne's hired guns. Already arranged. Federal inspector travels with his own security detachment. 20 cavalry troopers from Fort Apache, all with orders to investigate any interference with railroad business." Maggie felt the weight of Uncle Jeremiah's documents pressing against her ribs where she had hidden them inside her dress. Everything was coming together: the evidence, the legitimate authority to act on it, the protection needed to ensure justice was done. "Sheriff, I think Miss Mitchell might have some information that would interest this federal inspector." "I thought she might." Harlan touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Mitchell, I'd be honored to escort you back to town. Wouldn't want anything to happen to you before you could share that information." The ride back to Copper Ridge was entirely different from Maggie's earlier escape. Instead of skulking through alleys and hiding from Hawthorne's men, she rode openly down the main street beside the sheriff, her presence legitimized by law enforcement authority. She could see Hawthorne's sentries watching them with confusion and growing alarm. A frightened preacher's daughter was one thing, but that same woman returning with the sheriff suggested complications they hadn't anticipated. "They're starting to sweat," Harlan observed with satisfaction. "Been a long time since I've seen Hawthorne's boys looking uncertain about anything." Word of their arrival spread quickly through the network of watchers and informants. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, Dutch Morrison himself was riding hard down the main street, his face purple with rage and his hand on his gun. "Sheriff!" Morrison bellowed as he dismounted in front of the office. "That woman's a criminal. She broke into private property and stole documents. Is that so?" Harlan's voice was mild, but his hand rested on his own weapon. "What documents would those be, Dutch? Legal papers? Mining claims, property deeds?" Morrison was practically frothing at the mouth. "She's a thief and a trespasser." "Well now, that's a serious accusation. You got warrants for these alleged crimes?" Morrison's face went even redder. "I don't need warrants. I got authority from the territorial court to do what, exactly?" "Far as I can see, this young lady's been traveling peacefully along a public road. No law against that." Harlan's smile was thin. "Course, if you want to file formal charges, we can discuss it with the federal inspector when he arrives tomorrow." The Mention of federal authority hit Morrison like a slap. His small eyes darted between Harlan and Maggie, clearly calculating odds and risks. Whatever orders Hawthorne had given him, they probably didn't cover dealing with federal intervention. "This ain't over," he snarled finally. "Mr. Hawthorne's got legal claims to that mine, and no two-bit sheriff's gonna change that." "Maybe not," Harlan agreed. "But federal marshals have a way of sorting out legal from illegal pretty efficiently. Should make for an interesting conversation." Morrison remounted his horse and rode off, but not before giving Maggie a look that promised future violence. She watched him go with satisfaction rather than fear. For the first time since arriving in Arizona, she wasn't the one being hunted. Now it was Rex Hawthorne's turn to sweat as evening approached. Word came that the federal inspector's train had been delayed by a washout further east. The confrontation would have to wait another day. But instead of discouragement, Maggie felt only anticipation. She had survived everything Hawthorne could throw at her. She had turned his own arrogance against him, used his men's prejudices as camouflage, and maneuvered a corrupt situation until federal law was on her side. Tomorrow, Rex Hawthorne would discover that the helpless Eastern girl he had tried to intimidate was stronger than anyone had imagined. And that sometimes, appearing weak was the most dangerous thing of all. The locomotive's whistle echoed across the desert like a trumpet call announcing Judgment Day. From her position on the sheriff's office porch, Maggie watched the federal inspector's train pull into Copper Ridge's modest station, black smoke billowing against the crystalline blue sky. The sight of 20 cavalry troopers dismounting from the last car sent a visible ripple of unease through Hawthorne's men positioned around town. Federal Marshal Theodore Garrison was not what Maggie had expected. Instead of the grizzled frontier lawman she'd imagined, he was a compact, precise man in his 40s, wearing a well-tailored suit and carrying himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His steel-gray eyes missed nothing as they swept over the town's unusual number of armed men. "Sheriff Harlan," Garrison said, stepping onto the platform with measured steps. "Your telegram mentioned irregularities concerning railroad land acquisitions. I trust you have documentation to support these allegations." "More than documentation, Marshal. I've got a witness with first-hand evidence of fraud, intimidation, and quite possibly murder." Harlan gestured toward Maggie, who stepped forward with Uncle Jeremiah's papers clutched in her hands. "Miss Thornfield, I presume. I've read the initial reports about your uncle's death and the subsequent legal challenges to your inheritance." Garrison's voice was neutral, professional. "These are serious accusations you're making against a prominent territorial businessman." "They're serious crimes he's committed against honest citizens," Maggie replied, meeting his gaze directly. "And I have proof." The documents she presented told their story with devastating clarity. Uncle Jeremiah's meticulous records, the forged promissory notes Morrison had shown the territorial judge, the letter from Harrison and Associates revealing the mine's true value piece by piece. The evidence painted a picture of systematic corruption that made even the experienced federal marshal raise his eyebrows. "This is quite comprehensive," Garrison admitted after examining the papers for 20 minutes. "However, establishing the authenticity of these documents will require expert analysis and proving criminal intent rather than simple business disputes. Marshal." The voice belonged to Cole, who had appeared at the edge of the platform with Victoria Blackwood and the Sawyer brothers. "There's something else you need to see." They had brought a prisoner, Danny Carson, the young sentry who had tried to capture Maggie during her escape from the mine. The boy looked terrified, his hands shaking as he stood between Tom and Billy Sawyer. "This is one of Hawthorne's hired guns," Cole explained. "He's got information about how Morrison's been recruiting men for what they're calling security work." Danny's story, told in a trembling voice, revealed the scope of Hawthorne's operation. Men recruited from Texas and New Mexico with promises of easy money for keeping the peace. Instructions to intimidate small landowners into selling. Orders to use whatever means necessary to secure key properties along the railroad route. They told us it was all legal, Danny insisted. Said we were just protecting legitimate business interests from claim jumpers and squatters. And when those legitimate business interests required violence? Garrison asked quietly. Danny's face went pale. Morrison said accidents happened too. Folks who didn't know when to be reasonable. Said it was just the way things worked out here. The marshal's expression had hardened with each revelation. Son, do you understand that you're confessing to participating in a criminal conspiracy? Yes, sir. But I'm willing to testify against them if it means stopping this whole thing. Danny looked around at the faces surrounding him. Some of the boys, we joined up thinking we were gonna be lawmen, didn't know we were signing on to be murderers. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the proceedings. Rex Hawthorne himself was riding into town, flanked by Dutch Morrison and a dozen of his most trusted men. The cattle baron was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from years of getting his way through a combination of wealth and intimidation. Marshal Garrison, Hawthorne called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man accustomed to controlling every situation. I understand there's been some confusion about legal property transactions in my territory. Your territory? Garrison's eyebrows rose slightly. I wasn't aware that private citizens own territorial jurisdiction, Mr. Hawthorne. Figure of speech, Marshal. What I meant was the legitimate business operations I've been conducting in accordance with territorial law. Hawthorne's smile was smooth as silk. I'm sure we can clear up any misunderstandings quickly. Oh, I'm sure we can. Garrison gestured toward the documents spread across a makeshift table. These papers suggest your legitimate business operations have included forging legal documents, bribing territorial officials, and using armed force to seize private property. For the first time, Hawthorne's composure cracked slightly. His eyes flicked to the papers, then to Maggie, then to Morrison. Those documents were stolen from private property by a woman who has no legal standing to contest my legitimate claims. Your legitimate claims, Maggie said, stepping forward, are based on promissory notes that my uncle never signed. Notes that claim he borrowed money he never received from you for equipment he paid for himself. That's a serious accusation, young lady. Can you prove these documents are forgeries? Maggie smiled, and there was something in the expression that made Hawthorne take an involuntary step backward. Actually, I can. You see, Uncle Jeremiah had a very distinctive habit when he signed legal documents. He always included a small mark, a tiny star beside his signature. It was his way of distinguishing genuine papers from copies or drafts. She pulled out one of the authentic contracts from Uncle Jeremiah's hidden cache and pointed to the small mark beside his signature. Every legitimate document he ever signed has this mark. The promissory notes you presented to the court don't. Hawthorne's face had gone ashen. That's hardly conclusive evidence. Perhaps not by itself, Marshal Garrison agreed. But combined with testimony from your own employee about the criminal activities you've been conducting, and the fact that we found a printing press in your ranch house specifically set up for producing false documents. He gestured to one of his cavalry troopers, who stepped forward with a wooden crate full of evidence. We conducted a search this morning while you were in town, the trooper reported. Found plates for printing fake legal documents, correspondence with corrupt territorial officials, and detailed plans for seizing properties along the entire railroad. The trap had closed with devastating efficiency. Hawthorne looked around desperately, his gaze falling on Morrison and his men. But the big foreman was already backing away from his employer. Even hired guns weren't stupid enough to fight federal cavalry. This is a setup. Hawthorne snarled, his composure finally cracking completely. That woman's been planning this from the moment she arrived. She's not some innocent victim, she's a scheming little "Careful, Mr. Hawthorne." Cole's voice was soft, but his hand rested on his gun butt. "The lady's got more courage and integrity in her little finger than you've shown in your entire miserable life." Hawthorne spun toward Cole, his face purple with rage. "Mackenzie, I should have known you were involved in this. Still carrying that grudge over what happened in Silver Creek." "What happened in Silver Creek was murder," Cole replied quietly. "Just like what happened to Jeremiah Thornfield. And just like what would have happened to Miss Thornfield if she hadn't been stronger than you thought possible." Marshal Garrison held up a hand to forestall further confrontation. "Gentlemen, this is neither the time nor place for personal vendettas. Mr. Hawthorne, you're under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the federal government, forgery of legal documents, bribery of territorial officials, and accessory to murder." "Murder?" Hawthorne's voice cracked. "You can't prove I killed anyone, maybe not directly. But your employee, Mr. Morrison, has been very cooperative since we arrested him this morning. Seems he's willing to testify about specific orders you gave regarding the elimination of obstacles to your land acquisition program." The fight went out of Hawthorne like air from a punctured balloon. He stood in the middle of the street, surrounded by federal cavalry and faced with the ruin of everything he had built through years of corruption and violence. For a moment, he looked like what he really was, a pathetic old man whose greed had finally caught up with him. "Miss Thornfield," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. You don't understand what you've done. The railroad's coming through whether I control the water rights or not. You think the federal government will treat you any better than I would have? Maybe not," Maggie replied. "But at least they'll follow the law while they do it. And more importantly, they won't murder people to get what they want." Hawthorne was led away in shackles, along with Morrison and most of his hired gunfighters. The few who escaped into the desert would find themselves hunted by federal marshals with authority that extended far beyond territorial boundaries. As the dust settled, literally and figuratively, Maggie found herself standing in the middle of Copper Ridge's main street, surrounded by the people who had risked everything to help her. Victoria Blackwood, the Sawyer brothers, Cole Mackenzie, Sheriff Harlan, all of them looking at her with a mixture of respect and amazement. "So what happens now?" Billy Sawyer asked. "You gonna work the mine yourself?" "Actually," Marshal Garrison interrupted, "there's been a development regarding that. The Harrison and Associates letter mentioned in your evidence package prompted us to conduct our own geological survey. The mineral deposits in Thunder Mesa are extensive enough to justify federal oversight." Maggie felt her heart sink. "You're taking mine?" "Not taking it, Miss Thornfield. Partnering with you. The federal government needs reliable sources of copper and silver for the railroad construction, and you've proven yourself to be exactly the kind of honest, determined operator we want to work with." The terms he outlined were generous federal investment in mining equipment and infrastructure, guaranteed markets for the ore, and protection from future attempts at land grabbing. Most importantly, the mine would remain under Maggie's ownership and control. "There is one condition," Garrison added with a slight smile. "The federal government requires all mining operations of this scale to have proper security. We'll be assigning a permanent federal marshal to oversee the protection of this facility." He gestured toward Cole, who was trying to hide a grin behind his usual stoic expression. "Marshal Mackenzie comes highly recommended for this type of assignment." "Marshal?" Maggie blinked in surprise. "Cole's a federal marshal?" "Was," Cole corrected. "Took a leave of absence a few years ago after some trouble in Silver Creek. Been waiting for the right case to bring me back to active duty." "What kind of trouble?" Cole's expression grew serious. "The kind where corrupt cattle barons murder federal agents who get too close to their operations. Hawthorne thought he'd eliminated the threat by killing my partner and burning the evidence. He was wrong." The pieces fell into place in Maggie's mind. Cole's mysterious debt to Uncle Jeremiah, his knowledge of Hawthorne's operations, his professional competence with weapons and tactics, it all made sense now. Uncle Jeremiah was helping you investigate Hawthorne for 2 years, providing intelligence, documenting transactions, gathering evidence. Your uncle was a brave man, Miss Thornfield. He knew the risks, but he believed in justice more than he feared for his own safety. As the sun set over Thunder Mesa, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Maggie stood on the porch of her uncle's cabin, now truly her home, and watched the last of Hawthorne's men being led away in custody. The mine entrance gaped. Before her, no longer a symbol of danger, but of opportunity and legacy, Victoria Blackwood approached, her weathered face split by a satisfied grin. Your uncle would be proud, girl. You proved that appearances can be deceiving, and that real strength comes from standing up for what's right no matter the cost. It wasn't just me, Maggie replied. All of you risked everything to help someone. You barely knew. We knew enough, Tom Sawyer said. Knew you were Jeremiah's kin, and that was enough recommendation. Billy nodded agreement. Besides, someone had to show these territorial bullies that decent folks won't be pushed around forever. As her friends prepared to return to their own homes and responsibilities, Maggie felt a profound sense of completion. She had come to Arizona as a frightened refugee from industrial poverty, looking for nothing more than a roof over her head and a chance at independence. Instead, she had found a family of choice, a community worth fighting for, and the strength to stand against forces that had seemed insurmountable. Most importantly, she had discovered that real power didn't come from physical dominance or financial manipulation. It came from the courage to do what was right, even when doing right seemed impossible. Cole lingered after the others had gone, his pale eyes reflecting the last light of sunset. So, Miss Thornfield, ready to become a mining magnate? Ready to become whatever I need to be, she replied. Though I suspect that'll be more than anyone expects from a weak little Eastern girl. Cole's laugh was warm and genuine. Miss Thornfield, I think we've well established that you're a lot of things, but weak isn't one of them. As the stars began to appear over Thunder Mesa, Maggie Thornfield stood in the doorway of her inheritance, not just a mine or a cabin, but a new life built on the foundation of her own courage and the support of people who had learned not to judge strength by appearance. She had proven that sometimes the most dangerous opponent was the one no one saw coming. And in a territory where might had made right for too long, that lesson would echo for generations to come. 6 months after Rex Hawthorne's arrest, the Thornfield mine had transformed from a lonely hole in the desert into the most productive mining operation in the Arizona territory. The sound of machinery echoed off the walls of Thunder Mesa as steam-powered equipment extracted copper, silver, and traces of gold from veins that seemed to grow richer with each passing week. Maggie stood at the edge of the main shaft, watching a crew of 20 miners emerge from the depths with another load of high-grade ore. The woman who supervised them bore little resemblance to the frightened Eastern girl who had stepped off the stagecoach in Copper Ridge. Her hair was now pinned back in a practical style. Her clothes were durable work clothing tailored for comfort rather than fashion, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who wasn't afraid to pick up a shovel when the situation demanded it. But it was her eyes that showed the most dramatic change. Where once there had been uncertainty and fear, now there was confidence, determination, and something else, the quiet authority of someone who had earned their position through courage rather than inherited it through privilege. Miss Thornfield. The voice belonged to Timothy Walsh, Henry's younger brother, who had become the mine's chief engineer. Fresh out of the Colorado School of Mines, he had initially been skeptical about working for a woman barely older than himself. That skepticism had evaporated within a week of seeing Maggie in action. The new shaft has hit another vein, Timothy reported, his excitement barely contained. Assay results show even higher silver content than main deposit. At current Market prices were looking at a yield that could make this the richest mine in the Southwest. Maggie nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful rather than celebratory. What about the water table? Any signs of flooding or contamination? It was exactly the kind of question that had surprised everyone who worked with her. While other mine owners focused solely on extraction rates and profit margins, Maggie insisted on sustainable practices that would protect both the environment and the workers. She had seen what industrial pollution could do in Pittsburgh, and she was determined not to repeat those mistakes in Arizona. Water tables stable and were maintaining the filtration systems you specified. The spring chamber remains pure and uncontaminated. Timothy paused. Though I have to ask, most owners would prioritize immediate profits over long-term environmental concerns. Most owners haven't seen what happens when you prioritize short-term gains over everything else. Maggie replied, "This mine is going to operate for decades, hopefully generations. That means thinking beyond next quarter's profits to the kind of legacy we want to leave." The word legacy had taken on profound meaning for Maggie over the past months. Uncle Jeremy's legacy hadn't been just the mine itself, but the principles he had stood for: integrity, courage, and the belief that individual actions could make a difference against seemingly insurmountable odds. She had worked to honor that legacy in every decision she made. The miners received wages that were 30% higher than industry standard, along with medical care and accident insurance that was virtually unheard of in territorial mining operations. Safety protocols that most owners considered excessive were mandatory at the Thornfield mine because Maggie had learned that real strength meant protecting those who depended on you. "Miss Thornfield?" Another voice interrupted her thoughts. Cole Mackenzie approached across the cleared ground that now served as the mine's administrative center, his federal marshal's badge glinting in the afternoon sun. Even 6 months into his official assignment, Maggie still felt a small thrill at seeing him, not because of the romantic attachment that had developed between them, but because his presence represented everything she had fought to achieve. The territorial governors here, Cole reported, along with representatives from 3 major Eastern mining corporations and what looks like half the federal bureaucracy from Phoenix. Maggie suppressed a sigh. The success of the Thornfield mine had attracted attention from political and business leaders across the country, all of whom seemed to think they had valuable advice to offer about how she should run her operation. Most of them had never set foot in a mine shaft or dealt with the practical realities of extracting ore from solid rock. Let me guess, they want to discuss partnership opportunities and modernization strategies. Actually, Cole's expression was carefully neutral. They want to discuss something called the Thornfield Mining College. That got Maggie's attention. For weeks, she had been developing plans for an educational facility that would train miners, engineers, and mining administrators in the latest techniques and safety protocols. The idea had grown out of her frustration with the industry's resistance to innovation and her belief that education was the key to improving conditions throughout the territorial mining sector. "They've heard about your proposal?" "More than heard about it. Apparently, your detailed plans have been circulating through the Territorial Education Department and federal mining oversight agencies. There's serious interest in federal funding for the project." The meeting that followed was unlike anything Maggie could have imagined 6 months earlier. She sat at the head of a conference table in what had once been Uncle Jeremy's modest cabin, now expanded into a proper administrative facility. While territorial officials and federal representatives discussed budgets, curricula, and construction timelines for what would become the first mining college in the American Southwest. Governor Edmund Thornton, a portly man with impressive whiskers and an even more impressive opinion of his own importance, leaned back in his chair as he studied the architectural plans Maggie had commissioned. "Miss Thornfield, I have to admit that when I first heard about your unusual rise to prominence, In territorial mining, I was skeptical. A young woman running a major mining operation seemed like a recipe for disaster. And now? Maggie's voice was pleasant, but there was steel underneath. Now I'm wondering why we haven't been putting more women in charge of major business operations. Your mine is the most profitable, safest, and best managed facility in the territory. Your workers are loyal, your environmental practices are exemplary, and your profit margins are making other mine owners weep with envy. Federal Inspector Charles Radford, a lean man with the precise manner of someone accustomed to dealing with complex technical problems, spread additional documents across the table. The federal government is prepared to provide substantial funding for the Thornfield Mining College, contingent on its commitment to training miners from across the Southwest and Mexico. We see this as a model for industrial education throughout the region. What would be required in terms of federal oversight? Maggie asked. She had learned to be wary of government partnerships that came with strings attached, surprisingly little. Your management practices have become the standard we recommend to other mining operations. Rather than imposing federal requirements, we'd prefer to let you continue developing innovative approaches that others can adopt. Dr. Margaret Anderson, one of the few other women in the room and a representative of the Territorial Education Department, leaned forward with obvious enthusiasm. Miss Thornfield, your proposal for including courses in business management, labor relations, and environmental science alongside traditional mining engineering represents a revolutionary approach to industrial education. It represents practical necessity, Maggie replied. The mining industry needs people who understand that extracting ore is only part of running a successful operation. You also need to understand how to work with people, how to manage resources sustainably, and how to build businesses that serve the community rather than exploiting it. The conversation continued for hours, covering everything from admission requirements to faculty recruitment to the specific technical equipment that would be needed for hands-on training. By the time the meeting concluded, the Thornfield Mining College had evolved from a hopeful idea into a concrete plan with federal backing and territorial support. As the officials prepared to leave, Governor Thornton lingered for a private word with Maggie. Miss Thornfield, there's something else I wanted to discuss. The territorial legislature is considering a proposal to expand voting rights to include women property owners. Your prominent position has sparked considerable debate about women's capabilities in business and politics. I see. Maggie's expression was carefully neutral. And you're wondering whether I plan to become involved in political advocacy. I'm wondering whether you'd consider running for territorial representative. Your success here has made you something of a symbol, and symbols can be powerful forces for change. The suggestion was simultaneously flattering and daunting. Maggie had never imagined herself as a political figure, but she understood the broader implications of her success. If one woman could build a mining empire from nothing, challenge territorial corruption, and create innovative educational institutions, what could women accomplish if given equal opportunities? I'll consider it, she said finally. But right now, my focus is on building something that will last longer than any political career institutions, that will continue improving people's lives long after I'm gone. After the officials departed, Maggie found herself alone with Cole as evening settled over Thunder Mesa. They walked together to the promontory where Uncle Jeremy's grave overlooked the mine entrance, marked now by a simple stone monument that read, Jeremy Thornfield. He stood for what was right. Thinking about the governor's offer? Cole asked. Thinking about how strange life is. 6 months ago, I was a frightened woman with no prospects and no future. Now people are talking about me running for territorial office. You could win, you know. The territorial voters have watched you take on corrupt cattle barons, federal bureaucrats, and mining corporations. They respect results, and your results speak for themselves. Maggie picked up a handful of desert soil, and let it sift through her fingers. The mine, the college, even the political office, they're all just tools for building something better. The question is whether I can use those tools effectively without losing sight of what really matters, which is proving that strength isn't about how much you can intimidate or how much you can take from others. Real strength comes from how much you can build, how many people you can lift up, and how much better you can leave the world than you found it. Cole was quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade behind the mountains. Your uncle would be proud. Hell, he's proud, wherever he is now. I hope so. But I'm not doing this for him anymore, or even for myself. I'm doing it for everyone who's been told they're too weak, too small, or too different to make a difference. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Victoria Blackwood rode into the clearing, followed by the Sawyer brothers and a dozen other local ranchers and business owners. The group that had once been a desperate alliance against Hawthorne's corruption had evolved into something more, a coalition of progressive voices working to transform the economic and social landscape of the Arizona Territory. Maggie, Victoria called out as she dismounted. Got news from the federal prosecutor in Phoenix. Rex Hawthorne's been sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, and his entire land empire is being redistributed to the original owners or sold at public auction. Billy Sawyer was grinning broadly. Morrison got 15 years for conspiracy and accessory to murder. Most of his crew took plea bargains and testified against him. Justice served, Tom added with satisfaction. And word is that federal marshals are using the Hawthorne case as a model for investigating similar corruption in other territories. The news was satisfying, but Maggie found herself thinking beyond personal vindication to broader implications. What about the land redistribution? Are the original owners getting fair compensation? Better than fair, Victoria replied. The federal government's using Hawthorne's seized assets to provide low-interest loans for ranchers and farmers who lost their property to his schemes. Some families are getting back land that's been in their possession for generations. It was exactly the kind of outcome Uncle Jeremiah would have hoped for, not just punishment for the guilty, but restoration for the innocent victims of corruption. Maggie felt a profound sense of completion, as if a circle that had begun with her uncle's death was finally closing. There's something else, Victoria continued, her weathered face serious. The territorial legislature passed a resolution officially commending your courage in exposing the Hawthorne conspiracy. They're calling you a symbol of territorial integrity and an example of American determination. The formal recognition was gratifying, but Maggie knew that the real measure of her success wouldn't be found in legislative resolutions or newspaper headlines. It would be found in the lives of the people who had been affected by her choices, the miners who worked in safe conditions for fair wages, the students who would attend the mining college, the families who had reclaimed their stolen land. As the group settled around a campfire outside the cabin, sharing food and conversation as they had on countless evenings over the past months, Maggie felt a deep sense of belonging. These people had accepted her not because of her gender or background, but because of her actions and character. They had seen her at her weakest and most frightened, and they had also seen her find the strength to stand against seemingly impossible odds. You know what I've learned? She said as the fire crackled and sparks drifted up toward the star-filled sky. The most dangerous mistake anyone can make is assuming that strength and weakness are about physical size or social position. Real strength comes from understanding what's right and having the courage to act on that understanding, even when everyone tells you it's impossible. Cole raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. To impossible things, then. And to the people brave enough to prove they're possible. To Uncle Jeremiah, Victoria added, who started something he didn't live to finish, but made sure the right person was there to carry on his work. To family, Billy Sawyer said quietly, the kind you choose and the kind that chooses you. As the evening wore on and the conversation turned to plans for the mining college, infrastructure improvements for the territory, and the various business ventures that were sprouting up around the mine's success, Maggie reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had arrived in Arizona as a refugee from industrial poverty, expecting nothing more than a roof over her head and basic survival. Instead, she had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed, formed bonds deeper than any she had known, and built something that would outlast her own lifetime. Most importantly, she had learned that appearing weak could be the greatest strength of all, not because weakness was desirable, but because being underestimated allowed her to act with freedom and effectiveness that would have been impossible if others had recognized her true capabilities from the beginning. The lesson had implications far beyond her personal story. In a world where power was typically associated with physical dominance and financial manipulation, Maggie had proven that intelligence, courage, and moral clarity could triumph over seemingly insurmountable opposition. As the fire burned down to embers and her friends prepared to return to their homes, Maggie stood once more at Uncle Jeremy's grave. The mining college would break ground within the month. The territorial legislature was seriously considering women's voting rights. Federal oversight was ensuring that mining operations throughout the Southwest adopted safer, more sustainable practices, but perhaps most importantly, a new generation of women would grow up knowing that one of their own had faced down armed gunfighters, corrupt politicians, and powerful business interests, and won. They would know that strength came in many forms, and that being underestimated could be transformed into advantage through courage, intelligence, and the support of people who recognized true character. The stars above Thunder Mesa shone with the same light that had guided Uncle Jeremy through years of solitary work in the desert, and that had guided Maggie through her own transformation from apparent victim to undeniable force for change. That light would continue shining long after both of them were gone, illuminating the path for others who needed to discover their own hidden strength. In the end, Maggie Thornfield's greatest achievement wasn't the mine she'd saved, the college she'd founded, or even the corruption she'd exposed. It was the proof she'd provided that real strength had nothing to do with appearance, and everything to do with the courage to stand up for what was right, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. The cowboy who had put her to the test had learned, along with everyone else, that the most dangerous mistake was assuming you knew someone's capabilities based on how they looked. Sometimes, the person who appeared weakest was actually the strongest of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.